International Media TV. Television that listens to you.
Hi, I'm Johnnie Burrell. Welcome to the program.
I would like to welcome you all here to Marcus Bookstore this evening. You are in the oldest black bookstore in the country. We are getting ready to start our 52nd year in business. And so we very much appreciate your support over the years and certainly appreciate you coming out tonight to see my good, dear, wonderful friend Nelson George. Nelson is one of the first writers to document hip-hop culture, seeing Kool Herc in a Bronx schoolyard in the late 1970s. He would go on to write several award-winning books on the subject, including Hip Hop America and Russell Simmons' autobiography, Life and Death, and one of my favorites, Death of Rhythm and Blues. He directed Queen Latifah in the award-winning HBO film, Life Support, and executive produces VH1's long-running hip-hop honors broadcast. And for more information, you can visit Nelson at nelsongeorge.net. So without further ado, let me introduce Mr. Nelson, Mr. Wonderful, George.
Thank you.
You're welcome, sweetie.
So this is one of my favorite places in the whole country to come visit. As Blanche said, this is one of the oldest black bookstore in the country. I've read here on and off for like 20, 25 years. I've been coming here since I actually had hair and wasn't gray. And it's really an honor to be here, always is, to support one of the great institutions in black literature, quite honestly, because everyone's read here. The book I'm going to read tonight, or talk about tonight, is called The Plot Against Hip Hop. And the title strikes some people as sort of, seems like a nonfiction book. Well, as she said, I've written a lot about hip hop. I was one of the first writers really to write about it, and back when it was still a folk art. And I wanted to really explore where it is now from the point of view of someone who grew up with the culture, who had an emotional engagement with it, who felt it was a voice of rebellion, a voice of expression, now dealing in a world where hip-hop is commodified to the ultimate degree and has lost a lot of its cultural relevance as an expression of an urban or black experience. It's now is often an expression of a corporate brand's experience. And so I wanted to take those ideas and put those in a story. So in the novel, there's a character who's based on me. His name's Dwayne Robinson. He's a veteran music critic who ends up getting slain in what some people think is a Bloods initiation. But he has a mentee, a young man he's been working with for a while and telling history to, named D. Hunter, who's a bodyguard. He's a bodyguard for Jay-Z, among many. And he believes that there's something wrong with this murder. It wasn't simply some initiation, there was more going on with it. It turns out Dwayne was writing a book, a nonfiction book called The Plot Against Hip Hop. And the manuscript's missing. And so the book becomes not simply a murder investigation of Dwayne's murder, but through the investigation you get a window into kind of an alternative history of hip-hop, peopled by real characters and characters I've made up who are based on people that I've known or encountered. So I just want to read a little bit from the book and give you a little flavor of it. I also want to give a shout out to my friend Jua here, because there are sections in the book that Jua helped me research. So I want to thank her for that. Because the book also is a lot about conspiracy. And the idea that African Americans, we believe in conspiracies. We've had conspiracies perpetrated against us. And so that's another big thread. Because part of also what I'm trying to do in the story is sort of provide a context for a lot of those conspiracy theories. So almost every chapter in the book is named after a famous hip-hop song. Chapter 1 is called Big Pimpin', and you'll see why in a minute. Flashbulbs exploded into white light, and a rapid click of cameras felt like an automatic weapon aimed at innocent Iris. D. Hunter blinked and blinked again, trying not to appear as dizzy as he felt. This was no way to keep a rich MC safe. Jay, look over here. The camera posse shouted, and the rap star, record mogul, and living, breathing brand, the hottest chick in the game wearing his ring, paused for the paparazzi, looking dap in a creamy white suit with matching powder blue pocket square, tie, and trendy shades. He gave him his trademark sly smile and gracefully manipulated an unlit cigar like a mic. Dee hovered in the background, just out of camera range, his presence defining the edge of the frame. Used to be that rap stars wore loose jeans, sideways Yankees caps, and a snarl. Bodyguarding was more about protecting them from themselves than keeping them safe from others. Wasn't it a decade ago that Jay was on the front page of the Daily News, accused of stabbing some kid for bootlegging his CDs? He was public enemy spawned from the darkest reaches of the jungles of Crooklyn. Now Sean Carter was a king of New York, and as mainstream as afternoon baseball. Jay escaped the flashing cameras and walked down toward the Boathouse, a scenic outdoor restaurant event space off Fifth Avenue in Central Park, to the site of a huge charity event this balmy summer eve. A $1,000 ticket, 25 G's for a table, a nice tax deduction, a fat goodie bag, and maybe a boat ride with a celebrity made this a well-heeled, upscale crowd. He didn't know who or what they were raising money for, but he could see it was something in the hood, since hip-hop heavies and Upper East Side swells were clinking glasses and recklessly eyeballing each other. Diddy, Andre 3000, Andre Harrell, Q-Tip, Russell Simmons. Someone had even resurrected Farnsworth Bentley for the affair, and he spun his umbrella and pursed his lips for the amusement of the blue-haired and pale skin. Dee was outfitted in black, as was his custom, from his hush puppy loafers to his DKNY suit and his Gap t-shirt. He settled in behind a table at the rear of the Boathouse, where Jay was parlaying with two 40-ish Wall Street types. They were hyping him like crazy on a new energy drink, hoping to entice him to invest and endorse their can't-miss product. They wanted to call it Sparkle, and suggesting a supple bling effect from the drink. It's an aspirational beverage, they said, like hip-hop is an aspirational culture. 1 in every 100 cans would contain a piece of faux bling, and every 10,000th can would contain a real tiny diamond. Jay listened politely, nodded, and took the odd puff on his now-lit Cuban. Dee stood back, amused by the two white pitchmen, even as he wondered if he should buy some stock in the company the next day. He enjoyed working for Jay because the brother had cleaned up so nicely. But his mind wandered. There were no threats in his space, no gunmen in the trees, no niggas sweating Jay for more than a handout or a loan. The autograph seekers in this crowd were likely the offspring of the rich, which meant Dee let them ask away, knowing somewhere down the line their daddies might be useful to Jay. So instead of staring down an odd teenager with a napkin and a Mont Blanc pen, Dee stood there recalling his younger days when he'd go to the Apollo to see Dougie Fresh and Rakim headline, or the Union Square where kids slipped razor blades under their tongues, listened to Red Alert Spin, and scope for Vicks. He listened to old school at noon shows on the local hip-hop stations religiously, loving when a gem from the Classical 2 or the Treacherous 3 was dropped. P.E. and BDP and De La were the stuff that had animated his life when he was young. Now hip-hop was big business for him, just like it was for everyone who made records. His company, D Security, made its money monthly nut, securing starlets, MCs, A-list events, and the odd after-hours party. In large part, it was the remaining glamour of the rap game that kept his little business afloat. But those brothers did tend to pay slower than, say, Miley Cyrus. Dee absently touched the insignia. I'm going to cut down. Dee gazed around the Boathouse, glanced over where DJ Beverly Bond played the latest hip-hop R&B fusion from a cute faceless group, and thought of the parties in the park, and underground clubs, and mad passion that had made benefits like this possible. Parties where very wealthy white folk conspired with merely rich black folk to turn that energy into lucrative product. It was, Dee decided, the American dream manifest. In God we trust, in cash we lust. Dee glanced at his watch, and a bit Jay would bore over the business pitches and head over to the studio with his latest mentee, a kid from Baltimore who had crunk energy and old school skills, was laying down some tracks. Jay would probably stay most of the night, listening to how it was going down and adding his very important 2 cents. It was cool to see this vet work with his kid, but Dee wouldn't have to stay that long. One of his men would roll over for overnight duty, and Dee would slide over to his office in Soho to do paperwork. The accountant was coming in the morning, and he had to go over the books. Thank you, hip-hop, he thought. I owe you one. Chapter 2, Dead Homies. Again, another hip-hop song from Classic. Dee kept his office so dark, some people called it his dungeon. Black walls, burnished ebony wood furniture, no bright colors, nothing white save the printouts from his laptop, the envelopes containing bills that filled his inbox, and the skin of an occasional visitor. There was one gold record on the wall. It was for Public Enemy's It Takes a Nation of Millions, a gift from an old friend who'd been cleaning out his house in Jersey and gave it to him. The office was as big as a good-sized bathroom in a 4-star hotel. D Security's other room was fairly large meeting space down by a large conference table. Next to it was a setup to recharge batteries, a coffee machine, a locker where employees change clothes, and a pair of brass knuckles. D was writing an email to Russell Simmons about handling security for his next party when he heard a bump against the front door. He went into the little lobby, really just a waiting room with 2 metal chairs and an old Run DMC poster, and opened the door. Slumped at the foot of the door, wearing a bloody beige trench coat and a blue Yankees cap, was the music critic Dwayne Robinson. Blood oozed from the wounds on his chest and arms. It's a nasty slice to his right cheek. So he reached down and placed his hand against his friend's brown skin, hoping he could somehow slow the flood of blood from his neck. D's eyes flickered for a moment, and he mumbled, "D. Yeah, man, tell me who did this." "Remix. It's all a remix." "What? What?" Biggie was right. About what? It was all a dream. There was no more. No more light, no more words, no more Dwayne Robinson. His soul had departed. All that was left in D's hands were clothes smeared with crimson spots and a body soon to grow cold. D had seen death up close way too often to panic in his presence. In fact, it had once been almost as constant to his life as air, marking his childhood with ghoulish benchmarks. But that was back in Brownsville, Brooklyn, a lost neighborhood where the streets were saturated with generation after generation of ghetto blood. No one deserved to die, not his friends, not his brothers. No one who grew up in the Ville was surprised by death. But Dwayne Robinson was a middle-aged black intellectual, a music critic, an author. Why would anyone slash a man like that with a box cutter in goddamn Soho? D lifted up Dwayne's bloody palm, and his eyes began to water. He was rising to call the cops when he noticed a square black object clutching Dwayne's lifeless right hand. Hadn't seen one of those in years, he thought. The black Castic TDK audio cassette, like the kind he played 1,000,000 times in his old Panasonic boombox. It looked ancient. D knew this was now one of those crime scene evidence, but nevertheless prized the tape from Dwayne's stiffening fingers. Stuck to the side of the yellow label was scrawled the words Harlem World Battle. D went back into the office and dialed 911, all the while squeezing the TDK tape in his bloody hand. Looked around his office and realized he hadn't owned a cassette player in years. That was another era. High-top fades, painter's caps, 4-finger rings, Dapper Dan's Gucci knockoffs, Dwayne Robinson's era, Village Voice reviews, critical commentaries, NASA's rhetoric, all of it out of here like a KRS-One rhyme. A Red ID was listening to Rakim's Lyrics of Fury on his iPod when the first 2 patrolmen arrived. So that sets up the world that we're in. If you're a hip-hop fan, there's lots of little references throughout. There's even what I call an Easter egg. A lot of the names of some of the secondary characters in the books are very interesting. I'll leave it at that. Something for you to figure out and have a good time with. So I wanted to write a book that was really immersed in hip-hop culture, and that while the plot is about an event or a report about hip-hop, the journey is also about the soul of hip-hop. It's about where it's been, the connections that we have with it, and the sort of disconnections between the generations in hip-hop. Because now, people use this phrase hip-hop generation all the time, but actually we have a number of generations. And the gap between KRS-One or Snoop Dogg and Drake and Nicki Minaj is pretty wide. I mean, it's not even like they're the same music anymore. And in fact, if you talk to younger people who grew up, coming up now, their connection to the culture is different. In fact, it's almost like there's a culture and there's a product. And we've come to a point where actually the two things are disconnected completely. Now, one more thing I wanted to read, which is one of my favorite sections, and I have to thank Jua for a lot of the research in here. I really wanted to really know more about the world of hip-hop that a lot of young people view. And they view it through the prism of the internet. Their information and their sort of journey to it comes through that. And the internet is rife with all kinds of information, and one of it is a lot of conspiracy theories. And hip-hop is a particular site of conspiracy. And some of my friends actually are actually some of the people who are depicted in a very interesting way. So I want to just give you a little sample of both the story and of some of the stuff that's on the internet. And I want to thank Gejua again for finding a lot of this material for me. And so the title is another KRS-One. A lot of KRS-One references. You Must Learn is the title of this chapter. Back at his office with his Apple Pro computer radiating a blue glow upon his face, Dee contemplated his search options. If Dwayne Robinson was still alive, he'd have been the first person Dee would have called. He did the next best thing and called Dee's wife, Danielle. She said she knew of a thing called the Sawyer Report. It sounded vaguely familiar, but she looked through the biography of her husband's works and couldn't find it. After speaking to Danielle, Dee got on the phone to some editors at Source and Vive, but they were clueless when it came to anything that happened in hip-hop before 1992. He tried a couple of hip-hop academics, but they too were worthless on the paper. So now Dee did what he usually dreaded. He entered hip-hop cyberspace. Aside from checking out ESPN.com and NBA.com, Dee wasn't very interested in the internet. Normally would have asked his assistants or one of his net-addicted friends, but this investigation was his own, and he didn't want to involve any of them in it. So there he was on allhiphop.com, okplayer.com, globalgrind.com, and on, typing in Sawyer Report into search engines, querying editors and asking online communities if anybody had ever heard of it. From distant corners of the hip-hop world, bits of reconnaissance floated in. Davey D from the Bay Area had heard about it in the early 90s, but he'd never seen a copy. So young head on murderdog.com, this is a real website, folks, had a cousin who'd found a copy while researching his dissertation. But that relative had been shot dead, and he never found it. A kid in Amsterdam said his father had worked on it, but his pops didn't have a copy anymore. 20 pages in on Google, Dee came across the site called Hip Hop COINTELPRO. COINTELPRO had been the FBI's code name for its various nefarious strategies to undermine the efforts of black nationalists, US organization, and other nationalist groups to organize the black masses in the 50s and 60s. Character assassination, espionage, and straight-up murder were all coordinated by J. Edgar Hoover's men in a tragically successful campaign to send big afro-wearing leaders into jail, exile, insanity, or the grave. There have been scattered signs of law enforcement monitoring hip-hop throughout its short history. A police letter was once sent around the country warning local authorities about the danger of letting NWA perform in their jurisdictions. Rappers such as Busta Rhymes, who failed to cooperate with a couple of murder investigations, were regularly pulled over and searched by aggressive patrolmen and would look like systematic harassment. But nothing in the hip-hop era came close to Hoover's campaign of terror. The bottom line, for all their posturing as important voices of the people, MCs hadn't been dangerous to the system since the early 90s. These days, everyone was complacently capitalistic and proud of it. No need to waste government resources on diamond-studded entertainers who were more nuisances than threats when there were terrorist sand niggas for the government to follow. Yet Hip-Hop COINTELPRO was full of every conspiracy theory you could imagine. Biggie and Tupac were killed by elements of NYPD's Rogue Ramparts division. Bootleg rap CDs were being used to fund CIA counterterrorism programs in Central America and in the Caribbean. AIDS in Africa was a long-term strategy to clear large parcels of land for European and Chinese business interests. One story even went all the way back to the KKK owning a company that made troop jackets when they became popular urban gear. Like Fox News, Hip-Hop COINTELPRO sold paranoia and was damned entertaining in doing so. One section of his homepage read thusly: many people cannot fathom how deep this war against the rising consciousness in music is. Military intelligence directed psychological operations in the form of gangster rap, chemical warfare, described as crack, malt liquor, PCP, and heroin, to destabilize and commit genocide in targeted communities. Strategic biological warfare known as AIDS, the development of funding and co-opting of pseudo-gangs like the Bloods, Crips, and Latin Kings. This is one of my favorite sections. The major labels were all controlled by the same elite of people who ran their businesses through their cult and were the heads of secret societies like the Freemasons and Illuminati. For a musician to sign with one of these labels, you have to be willing to work toward an agenda, to eventually obtain total control over the world population. This doesn't mean that all artists signed are aware of the agenda, but they are tied to the rules of the industry. These artists become mind control victims of a programmer or handler, usually a manager or attorney, which has a lot of validity to it. Now, one of my favorite images on the site, or one of Dee's favorite images on the site, was a Rose Garden picture of President Ronald Reagan and Vice President George H.W. Bush with the caption, "The real godfathers of crack and gangster rap." Next to it was a Reagan quote, of these troubled times, our objective, a new world order can emerge. Another item linked a Los Angeles physician who had treated Eazy-E, comic Martin Lawrence, and funk star Rick James to MK Ultra, a mind control program developed by the CIA in the 1950s. Eazy and James had supposedly been tools used to pollute young minds, while Martin's cross-dressing Big Mama films were attempts to undermine the masculinity of black males. And Tyler Perry got a mention here too. Def Jam Records came in for a particular scrutiny on the site, which argued that since its founding by the quote-unquote mysterious and enlightened one Rick Rubin, the legendary label had been a hotbed of satanic warfare against hip-hop. Videos by Jay-Z, Kanye, and Beyonce were cited for patently satanic iconography that promoted teen suicide. D wasn't sure he wanted to go forward. This commingling of hip-hop, government mind control, and Satan unsettled him. He'd heard bits and pieces of all this paranoia in conversations on tour buses and in VIP booths. It was crazy stuff to him. There was something strangely yet compelling about it. Plus, it's where the trail seemed to lead. So D went on the message board and typed in, "I'm looking for a copy of a marketing report on a company called Sawyer on a hip-hop audience in the late 80s. The late great writer Dwayne Robinson worked in it. I'd like to get a copy. I'm willing to pay for the pleasure." He included his email address at the end of the message. Not 30 seconds later, his BlackBerry buzzed. The message was from True God at Hip Hop COINTELPRO. He wanted to know, who the fuck are you? He hit him back with a little bio and mentioned his relationship to Dwayne Robinson. 2 minutes passed, sorry about that. True God's next message. "Meet me at the corner of 116th Street in St. Nicholas tomorrow at 1 p.m. So that's a little bit of flavor of all of that good stuff. Thank you. So that's, I mean, it's really a lot of, and you see there's a lot of real people in the book. A lot of what happened in the book are things I was actually at. So there's parties that I was at. There's the Hip Hop Honors, a show I worked on for a lot. There's scenes that happened there that really happened. There's even a scene, one of the last scenes in the book happens on a boat ride around Manhattan, where there's Jay-Z's on it, Beyonce, Alicia Keys, and Mary J. Blige. This is a real boat ride. And so when I was actually on the boat, I was saying to myself, I got to put this in something. This is going to end up somewhere. I don't know if it's going to be a nonfiction or fiction book, but then the idea came up that I have a character as a bodyguard, so the bodyguard is bodyguarding the people on the boat. So it ends up becoming a kind of funny scene. And I remember, even I wrote in the book, and I actually remembered at the time, I said, if this boat sinks, man, that's the end of R&B. It's just gone right there in that one boat ride. So it's very much, those of you who know the work of James Ellroy, who did L.A. Confidential, a famous movie, but a lot of other books, he kind of draws upon the idea of taking real events that happen. He focuses on L.A. and just creating a fictional world around it. And I really was struck by that. There's a famous book by Philip Roth called The Plot Against America that really gave me the title, because this is amazing. Like, and again, his book really looked at history of the 1930s. What if Roosevelt hadn't been elected president the first time? What would have happened in America? So I just thought, what if there was a conspiracy? I mean, but not just the Illuminati, there's some more, but like, what if there was a long-term thing that involved people within the industry to control the development of the culture? And I've been around enough stuff with it to have, and like the Sawyer Memorandum, this was a real report that I saw 89-90, investigating the hip-hop audience and how to penetrate it. I remember when this thing happened with the FBI letter. I remember a lot. I mean, I met the guy who created the hip-hop cop in New York, created the first hip-hop dossier. And I actually saw the dossier, and he'd have a page on Jay-Z. He'd have every place he lived, license plate, registration numbers, studios. So everywhere Jay-Z would go, he knew everything. I mean, these things are not necessary. These aren't false. These are true. So the level at which, so I just extended the level of maybe a bit of how that worked, but it's all based in stuff that's plausible. For me, the Illuminati thing was a little, it's like I can't believe in these crazy Italians still, but I can believe in greedy businessmen hooked up with law enforcement people to get things done. And there's actually a couple of, I just realized when I did a reading in LA, there's a scene in the book actually that I actually probably should have taken out. It's not identifiable to us, but there's some stuff in there like, oh, I may have went too far. But I mean, it's all very much grounded in reality. And I wanted to do that because I felt like we're in an era now where, for people who are in hip hop, that you don't want to. It's very much about being based in reality. So it could have been a nonfiction book in some level, but I really wanted to explore the idea, can I use the traditional detective, Walter Mosley kind of model to tell a modern story about what's going on now? And the response has been excellent so far, and the reviews have been great, so I'm really going to continue to use music. I want to do another book, I was telling Blanche, using the lore of rhythm and blues and soul, and then do one with jazz as well. But the characters will sort of continue forward. Because with black music, we don't really get a chance, we talk about it all the time, but there's a legacy of mythology that we've created over years and years of music that we don't really tap into. That we don't really, and every now and then you'll see a movie like Crossroads that's loosely based on Robert Johnson or whatever. But I just think that there's an opportunity to create a whole, in a way like my favorite writer, the great late August Wilson, who took a lot of the lore of music, blues particularly, and did a whole raft of amazing plays about that. So that's one of my little missions now, is to try and use our legacy, use our history, and also tie in the fact is that we have many unsolved mysteries within our community, and to have some fun with that, and also maybe to illuminate with that as well. So that's really what I was going for with this book. Anybody want to talk or ask any questions or so on? I'm okay.
I wanted to ask, I have a friend who read the book.
Yeah.
And she enjoyed it, but her question, she kind of questioned by the name of the book, she wanted to know what audience you were targeting, because she felt by the name of the book that maybe a certain audience would buy the book, and the book is more literary lore, and it's not hip-hop drama, so to speak. So I guess my question is, you said it's being well received, so, so are the people that you think are going to read the book are reading it, or did you expect a certain audience, or what?
I write every book I write for the same person, which is I always write for someone who was me when I was 21 years old, because I remember who I was and how curious I was about the world, and I was very interested in reading, and so to me I always write that way. I always write for a curious young person, and I don't really try and I mean, I'm not the kind of writer who can go ahead and target, I'm going to write just for this demo. I mean, I just write, I always felt like this is a story I wanted to tell. I really wanted to look into the world of hip-hop in this way. And then you see see what's out there. I mean, I'm not a target marketer like that. So the one thing I will say is that I've written a lot of nonfiction books, and there is an interesting dichotomy between people who read nonfiction and people who read fiction. Women tend to, in theory, read more fiction. That's the series I've seen. And men tend to read more nonfiction. And I've always had this interesting dichotomy between whenever I do a nonfiction book, often the book is, I'll have have more male readers, let's say, or more overtly male work than fiction books. And I've done my novels, more women. And I wanted to figure out, is this a story that can merge those two communities? So to that degree, I would say that I wanted to write a book that had interest for the nonfiction people who like the music history stuff I've done, but that also has a narrative that's a fiction. Because you can't write the same book over and over again. I've already done like one big nonfiction book on hip hop, and I felt like if I'm going to come back and go on that same terrain, I wanted to come from a different place. I wanted to try and expand that dialogue in a different way. And this is one of the most fun experiences I've had as a writer, quite honestly, having this balance and trying to make this work. So far, so good, and I think you create an audience with the work. I don't think, unless you're just a hack, you're just writing for, which people do. But that's not what I do.
So you mentioned that you talked about there being like different generations within the hip hop generation, opposed to people who grew up with like hip hop in the 80s, 90s, and what's going on now. So how, in seeing how your book has been received, how do you see it speaking to those different generations? Like, do you get a different response, let's say, from younger people who are growing up with hip hop now, and kind of how do they respond to like the history and where they, and and where they think their generation is going to take the music.
Well, it's very funny. The funniest thing, because I'm not a fan of Drake.
I'm not a fan.
I don't like Drake. I don't like Drake's voice at all. It just irritates me. Too much auto-tune on it. Too much auto-tune. I can't and all that singing. Oh my God. So I had a whole funny debate. So I did this thing in Brooklyn, and a younger woman was there, and she came over afterwards. I like Drake, and so we had an interesting dialogue because Drake is interesting because he's he makes pop rap. You know, he makes things that have big hooks. He is a good rhymer. He writes good rhymes, but he's very internal. A lot of his writing is about his internal journey. It's almost like they call it emo rap, you know. And I'm not really interested. I'm not that interested in. I'm not that interested in Drake's internal journey.
I agree.
So there is a generation gap, different eras. I do find that the book is being well received by people who come up. I don't know who grew up on hip hop and have a more interest in hip hop as a social commentary, political weapon. And to me, that's one of the things that is missing. And one of the things that happened, and the book talks about this a lot, and it's one of the main threads, is that starting really around the turn of the century, and we can use that phrase now, is that the record business went like this. Kind of disappeared. So artists no longer make their main money off their records, really. They make their money off their endorsement. Like Drake made a lot of money off his I think it was 7-Up or Sprite endorsement. Had commercials and stuff. Even before he really had a hit record, he had a huge commercial campaign. So when you have that be one of the main threads of how people make money, that then affects what they write about. And so there's less and less political commentary in the music because are you going to piss off X amount of brand, the jean company, perfume company, car company that you're making your money off of, as opposed to just expressing what I want to say. It's more of the chilling effect. There's a guy named Steve Stout. I shouldn't say this on camera, I'll leave that alone. But just say this, that there are people who are out who are promoting the idea of hip-hop as a brand is good, as a product. And it may be good as a business venture for the artist. It's not good for the culture of hip-hop as an expression. And if you travel around the world, hip-hop is still a voice of opposition in Senegal, in Japan, in France, in Colombia. But it has not really that here anymore, at least the mainstream. You have your Boots Riley, you have your Mortal Technique, you have people who in this environment with the Occupy movement are really it's really benefiting them because they've always been out there doing that work. But in terms of the mainstream market, there's very little commentary about whatever's going on from Afghanistan to Iraq to unemployment. And ironically, one of the few people who does do that in a very strange but inconsistent version is Kanye West. Because he kind of talks stream of conscious. So he may talk about unemployment, he may talk about that, but he'll also talk about Margiela and the other brands. So he's an interesting guy because he embodies that duality.
Common.
Well, Common's not that political, but he is conscious, if that makes sense. So anyway, so there is an agenda with the book, and I don't disguise that. We are talking about promoting those kinds of ideas. And so it was interesting to embed it in the story rather than try and make it an essay, I guess.
I want to thank you for coming out and doing this presentation on your book. My question is more from a business standpoint. What type of grip does corporate America have or attempt to have on hip-hop, which is a multi-billion-dollar business? And the reason why I say that is looking at when Hallmark took over Mahogany Cards, successful business. Viacom bought BET for like $3 billion. So you Black put something out on the market. From Black art on down the line, people either gobble it up or attempt to gobble it up. Where do you see this on, say, a scale of 1 to 10? Where's this at right now?
Oh, 8 or 9. I mean, all you have to do is you go look at. There was a recent article actually. If you look at Forbes magazine does an annual roundup of hip hop millionaires, and the percentage of money that they make off the actual music is increasingly small. So Diddy makes his money off Ciroc, or his perfume, not so much his perfume, but more the Ciroc. So a good example of the difference is that if you go to, certain artists have deals with, Pitbull, for example, has a vodka, and he makes, he's a partner in that vodka. So the line between a music video and a commercial is disappeared. He gets paid for the references he makes to the vodka. So what you're really buying are commercials with music, as opposed to actual anything that might be vaguely called a personal expression. That's throughout the entire spectrum. So it has changed what people talk about, because if that's where your money comes from, then you don't delve into waters that might at all be controversial. So it's had a profound effect. And also, a lot has to do with the fact that the record business has shrunk. So it's not like my main source of revenue are the records. They are these other ancillary businesses that are now the main business. So it's definitely had a big effect. And it's definitely changed. And it's one of the ideas that we deal with a lot in the plot against hip-hop. There's a character who basically is sort of a Steve Stout character. And he voices that side of the dialogue. So it's complicated, but it is definitely, over time, when you look at where the music is, in terms of what people rhyme about. I mean, basically what we have is dance music. And it's always been dance music, but it was dance music with different textures. Now the mainstream, the biggest artists have personality interest and they're interesting, but they're not really talking about anything outside of the spectrum that could get them in trouble.
So then, do you see the tide changing? Do you see like that consciousness coming back? Do you foresee a swing back to having more diversity in the music?
Well, I think what's happening is that because everything is so much fragmented, I mean, it's a very different business. It's not like it's harder to make someone massive. Most of the artists who are bigger now, if you take Drake and Nicki Minaj, both were kind of vetted by Lil Wayne. A lot of times it's a big star who brings on someone as a guest, and then they try and make, they're trying to do it with J. Cole, with Jay now, it was Jay-Z now. So it's very hard to come in and become massive without being leveraged by another bigger brand, if you will. But what you do see is all these different sections. Like a guy like Lupe Fiasco has become very prominent and has a very interesting point of view. The Roots' new album is going to be very interesting. It's called Undone. And basically, it's kind of their attempt to do a hip-hop concept album where it's from birth to death of a young black man. And they're going to try and use that as a vehicle to explore a lot of these ideas that we're talking about. So there are people doing more ambitious stuff, but in the midst of all of that, there's this, So I think there'll always be a market, but it's never going to be, it's going to be very fragmented. I mean, a guy like, I don't know if people, Immortal Technique, I don't know if you're familiar with him. Okay. His new mixtape is probably one of the biggest things he's had. It's over almost 300,000, 350,000 downloads, largely because of the fact that the Occupy thing is happening, and it's made people be attracted to political commentary in a way they weren't before or weren't checking for before. I think that's interesting because I think when I went out to Occupy Wall Street, there were I saw lots of young MCs shooting videos there, becoming part of that dialogue. So I do think that it's becoming, the Occupy movement has had a lot of effects and will have a lot more ripple effects. But one of the things that has happened is to reintroduce people to the idea of social commentary within hip-hop. It doesn't mean they're all going to become big pop stars, but it means that if you go on the internet, it's no longer like just, Ciroc and popping bottles. There's a lot of other things going on. So I think that this has been good. I think this is I think the next year, between now and the election, is going to be wild. Between the Tea Party and Occupy, there's going to be a lot of interesting, and it's a great opportunity for artists who want to go that way to find an audience, perhaps in a way they weren't 3 years ago. So I just want to thank everyone for coming out. I love Marcus Books. Thank you.